Karoline Leavitt boarded the plane with the effortless composure of someone who had spent years navigating rooms where power was not announced. It was simply understood first class was nearly for the cabin humming with the low murmur of controlled voices, the soft clink of glasses, the rustle of newspapers being folded with precision. He walked down the aisle, noting the familiar faces, a senator from New York, his head bent toward his aide, whispering about upending vote, a media executive, adjusting his cufflinks, scanning headlines that he likely had a hand in shaping, a political strategist, eyes flicking between passengers, calculating which conversations would be worth having before takeoff. These were the people who dictated narratives, who decided sometimes in spaces, no bigger than this cabin, who was in, who was out, and who would never belong. Karoline reached her seat, a window spot near the front. Another flight, another city, another speech to give, hands to shake. No. British to mold. She placed her bag beneath the seat in front of her, buckled in, and let out a slow, measured breath. Then something shifted, not loud, not obvious, but real. She felt it in the way conversation slowed, the subtle pause of a senator's hand over his tablet, the glance exchange between two journalists across the aisle. Oh, damn bungy. No had stepped onto the plane. She didn't turn immediately. Instead, she observed the reaction. Some passengers stiffened their posture, sharpening as if his presence alone unsettled something in them. Others smirked, exchanged quiet glances, the unspoken sentiment passing between them like an invisible current. They had been expecting this moment. Dan Bungie, wasn't a stranger to these spaces, but he had never been truly welcomed in them either. For years, he had stood in the background of power, watching, protecting, anticipating threats before anyone else even noticed they were there. As a Secret Service agent, he had guarded presidents, taken bullets for people who barely registered his presence. But now he was different. Not a bodyguard, not a quiet, unassuming fig. You're in the backdrop of history now. He had a voice in Washington, hated that he built his own platform, spoken to, freely refused to ask for permission before challenging the same people who now sat in these rows pretending not to watch him. And that Karoline realized was why the air felt so heavy. Damn bones, wasn't supposed to be here. You're not in first class, not in their world. A flight attendant, her movements careful, professional, intercepted him near the front of the cabin. I'm sorry, sir, she said, glancing down at the tablet in her hands. There's been a change in seating. First class is for silence, not a true silence. The engine still hummed. I still shifted in glasses, but the kind that stretched, thick and deliberate. Dan didn't react right away. He wasn't the kind of man who blurted things out, who fumed or made a scene. He simply stood there, letting the moment breathe, reading it, understanding it. Then from somewhere nearby, a dry chuckle. Guess they figure it out, someone muttered. Another smirk. A shift in posture, the flick of a wrist, adjusting a tie, the casual crossing of legs in amusement. They weren't hiding it. They wanted him to see. Karoline exhaled, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. This wasn't about a seat. It was about a message, a quiet, publicly moval, a reminder, a way to show him in front of everyone that no matter what position he was nominated for, no matter how many people followed his words, he would never be one of them. She had seen this game play before. She had watched senators sink careers without a single statement. She had seen men and women strategically excluded, not through force, but through something far more insidious, manipulation, control. And tonight, damn Bond, we're supposed to sit and coach, supposed to understand that there were places where people like him would never belong. Karoline's gaze flicked to the front of the cabin. She saw the smirks, the knowing glances, the careful way. Some passengers avoided looking in Dan's direction at all. She exhaled slowly. Then without hesitation, she unfastened her seatbelt and stood the air in first class. At thickened, silent or charged, Karoline could feel it pressing in, stretching across the rows, settling in the quiet amusement on their faces. They thought, I was funny, a man who had spent his life in service, now being quietly dismissed. A man who has stood behind presidents, now being told to take his place somewhere else. Karoline scanned the room, eyes flicking over the Polish seats, the neatly folded newspapers, the careful postures of men who believed their presence alone made them watchable. And then she laughed, short, cold, sharp. It cut through the cabin like a scalpel, slicing through their feigned disinterest, forcing their attention onto her. The flight attendant hesitated, shifting awkwardly, suddenly unsure of her role in the theater of humiliation that had been unfolding so smoothly just moments ago. Karoline, He turned slightly, facing the rows of powerful men and women who had so eagerly watched this play out. "You all think you're very clever, don't you?" A few of them blinked. Someone coughed lightly, as if pretending not to hear her. She let her voice carrying, not yelling, but making sure there was no mistaking her words. "Every one of us sitting here because at some point you convinced people you deserve to be. You made speeches, shook hands, maneuvered yourselves into positions of influence. And now you think that makes you the gatekeepers of who belongs here." She scoffed, shaking her head. "But let's be honest. If something went wrong, really wrong, who in this cabin would people turn to?" She let the question hang, her eyes scanning their faces. A senator tightened his grip on his whiskey glass. A journalist shifted uncomfortably. A CEO stared down at his tablet, pretending he was reading something important. None of them answered, because they knew not them, not the man who wrote policy briefs or whispered rumors into the ears of reporters, not the ones who lived off connections, off carefully cultivated influence. No, if something went wrong, they would turn to the man they just tried to humiliate, to Dan Bungie. No, the man who had stood in fire, the man who had faced real threats, not a theoretical kind discussed over cocktails at fundraisers, the man who had spent years preparing for moments they had never even considered. Karoline exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "This isn't about a seat," she said. "It's about the fact that all of you need him, and you hate it." Silence, the kind that wasn't just quiet, but hollow. The flight attendants swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the tablet in her hands. Karoline turned to her. "You should be ashamed of yourself." The woman flinched. "You let them make you a part of this. You let them use you to send a message. You knew exactly what you were doing when you walked up to him." Karoline's voice was like steel now. "And for what? A few nods of approval from people who wouldn't think twice about replacing you if it suited them." The flight attendant's face burned red. She didn't respond. Karoline turned back to the cabin, sweeping her gaze over the men and women who had orchestrated this little humiliation. "You spend your lives pretending you're in control," she said. "But you're not a bee. You're just lucky men like him exists to protect you anyway." And with that, she unfastened her seatbelt. She turned to do. Dan, who had been silent through it all, watching, assessing, waiting. She met his eyes. "Take my seat." His gaze flicked over her, measuring something. But she held from. He nodded once. No thanks, no hesitation, just understanding. Dan stepped forward. And just like that, the balance shifted. Dan Bungie took his seat, not with arrogance, not with triumph, just quiet certainty. And that was what unsettled them the most. He didn't need their approval, didn't need their permission. Karoline had forced their hand, now they had to sit with it. She turned, stepping away from first class without another glance, moving toward the back of the plane, where the seats were tighter, where the air didn't carry the false weight of manufactured importance. She had made her choice, but as she passed through the curtain, she knew this wasn't over. Coach felt different. No hushed power plays, no whispered negotiations over steak and wine. Here people were tired, restless, and guarded. A mother rocked her baby. A man scrolled through his phone, bleary-eyed. A teenager slumped against the window, earbuds, oblivious to the quiet storm that had played out just beyond the curtain. Karoline found her new seat, middle row. No space. The man beside her had already claimed the armrest on her other side. A woman adjusted her travel pillow, settling in for the long flight. Karoline exhaled. The senator in first class still had his leather seat. The journalists still had his influence. The executives still had their networks. But for the first time, they had been forced to recognize a truth they had spent their careers avoiding. They weren't untouchable. And the people they looked down on, the ones they dismissed as unworthy, they were the ones who actually mattered when things got real. Dan Bond, had earned his place. And now they all knew it. Then the turbulence hit. Not a mild kind. Not the brief shudder that came and went. The first drop was shot. Sharp. The second was worse. A ripple of unease moved through the cabin. Someone cursed under their breath. A flight attendant in the galley grabbed onto the near seat. The fastened seat belt sign blinked back on a crackle over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've hit an unexpected weather system. Please remain seated." Another hard job. Not a baby started crying. Karoline tightened her grip on the armrest, keeping her breathing steady. She had been through turbulence before. But this wasn't just about the plane. This was about what fear did to people. She turned her head instinctively. Dan was standing, not gripping the seats like the others, not bracing himself with uncertainty. "Move." The bus, a flight attendant, stood nearby, her face, pale, knuckles white around the edge of a tray. Dan's voice was low, steady. How bad? She hesitated. We lost radio contact with the crew for a minute. Systems are fine, but the turbulence. She shook her head, then nodded. That was all he needed. Then his eyes moved, not scanning for threats, scanning for people, passengers, gripping their armrests too tightly, faces, pale posture, stiff, the subtle ways. Fear settled into a body. He crouched slightly beside an older man whose fingers had gone white against the armrest. Your good day, and said voice, even this. Plane is going down. The man swallowed hard, nodding. Dan straightened, making his way toward the back, toward her. Karoline tilted her head as he reached a row. You all right? He asked. She smirked slightly. Shouldn't I be asking you that? Damn. Let out a short breath, something between a chuckle and OC. She followed his gaze as it flicked toward first class, toward the unseen faces beyond the curtain. They're scared, she said. They should be, he murmured. Not because of the turbulence, because of what it had exposed when things went wrong. Power meant nothing, not titles, not wealth. What mattered was who people looked to when the ground became unsteady. And tonight, for all their dismissals, all their quiet smirks, all their attempts to control the narrative, they looked to him. The turbulence softened, the plane steadied, the worst of it passed. But Karoline knew, as sure as she knew her own name, the storm wasn't just in the sky, it was waiting for them when they landed, because Dan Bono had boarded this flight as an outsider. He was leaving it as something else entirely. #phone for get through can buy Hawk. The turbulence faded little by little. The plane steadied, the sharp jolts replaced by a smooth rhythm. Passengers exhaled, some leaning back, others letting go their arm rests with stiff fingers. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the cab, and forced, uncertain, the kind of laughter that came from people trying to convince themselves the worst was over. Karoline knew better. The worst wasn't the shaking plane. It was what had been revealed in the shaking. She turned slightly, watching Dan as he made his way back toward his seat. He moved with the same steady confidence he always had, unshaken, unaffected. And yet everything had changed. Not for him, for them, for the people in first class who had spent the flight pretending he didn't belong, pretending that his kind of experience, his kind of strength, had no place among them. And then, when fear gripped the cabin, when their carefully curated control slipped through their fingers, who had they looked to? Not the senators, not the media executives, not the strategists who spent their lives shaping narratives. They had looked to the man they are, tried to push aside, and Karoline had seen the realization settle into their faces, silent but undeniable. Damn Bongino didn't need their approval, they needed him. The plane began its descent, the city lights growing larger below. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, will be landing shortly. Thank you for your patience. Karoline exhaled, rolling her shoulders back. She knew what would happen next. By the time they reached the terminal, the whispers would start again. Not the same dismissive murmurs from before, different now, uncertain, hesitant. By tomorrow, someone would spin it. The turbulence would be a metaphor, the shift in power, an anecdote buried in an op-ed. Some would pretend nothing had happened at all, but the people on this plane would remember. She turned down as he settled into the seat beside her. You make a damn good deputy director, she said. Dan smirked slightly, shaking his head. We'll see. She studied him for a moment. They looked back toward the front of the plane, the curtain between first class and co.